for having me, ladies and gentlemen. Speaking of ladies, did you notice there is some kind of elephant in the room here? Did you notice the lineup of this conference that is somewhat missing an important part of our existence as human beings, which is women. Heather Kelly had to cancel, and so we are left with only one female speaker, which is a little disappointing. No, it's actually a pretty serious thing, because we cannot really change the industry, overnight. We know that the industry is still male-dominated, but we can definitely do a lot more. It's way easier to arrange a fairly balanced lineup of presenters rather than changing the whole prejudice we have about programming and so on. Anyway, so yeah, I'm gonna play this just to sound test. So yeah, this is a silly one. It's the life of Jesus in 10 seconds. But I was actually quite serious about it. To me, it was an experiment in reduction. How low definition, how low resolution you can go. Not only in terms of graphics, but also in terms of storytelling. What is the most minimal storytelling act you can possibly perform in a video game? Anyways, yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Paolo Pedercini. I'm from Italy. I've been living in the United States for a bunch of years. So I guess at this point in time I sort of pose as artist. I teach at an art school, but I'm not one of those artists interested in those gallery spaces and the white rooms and prepared audiences, this kind of like very nice, wealthy culture people who hang out in those spaces. I'm more like interested in that range of artistic and cultural practices that go beyond those white boxes. I'm more into that huge network of media that is created by bored office workers, by bored students and bored housewives or internet surfers in general that are essentially sharing content on the net in a viral and organic way. That's kind of like my social context and my medium, and the idea is to that all these people all together contribute to this big network, and I'm kind of interested in injecting radical, subversive memes in this kind of like constant flow of bullshit. Most of my work is released under the project name Molla Industria, which means soft factory or soft industry. It's a personal project. I sometimes collaborate. It deals with ideology and electronic entertainment. So the idea is to combine this old idea of social communication with the relatively new idea of culture jamming. So on one hand, using games as forms of communication to spread alternative messages. And this is a game that I made for a stem cell research referendum. So it was kind of like almost like a flyer or a video, so very straightforward, a game with a message. And on the other hand, using games, kind of like a deconstructing game or messing with the language of mainstream games, kind of like a remedy against the idiocy of mainstream games, the stupidity of mainstream games, and kind of like responding or reacting or questioning mechanics we take for granted. So this is Fate Fighter that came out a few years ago, which is a kind of like a twist on well, not really a twist, but kind of like a riff on a fighting game in which instead of having this kind of like sexualized, ethnicized caricature of fighters, you have kind of like caricatures of religious figures fighting against each other as they do in the real world, but they are monster-sized, and every time they fall, they destroy the world, the human world behind them. Anyway, this is another example. Queer Power also employs the sort of visual arrangement that you're familiar with, the 2D fighting game, except every element is essentially reversed. So instead of fighting, you are involved in this strange intercourse. Instead of having an energy bar, you have a pleasure bar. Instead of taking away the energy, you're giving pleasure to the other player. Instead of having special moves, you essentially change, shape-shift, and change gender according to your own desire. So that's an example of kind of like changing, questioning the mechanics and why all games have to be violent and so on. So one of the things that I'm mostly interested in is to go beyond what is called, like, what we can call the escapist function of games, of video games especially. Like saving princesses, collecting money, eating mushrooms, kind of leveling up, this kind of like power fantasy, acquiring new powers. More often than not, games are just wish-fulfilling teenage fantasies. And to me, they sort of make up for all the inequality, injustice, and the boredom of our social system. Like you have a kind of like a not that interesting job, but at least when you go home, you can pretend you are some kind of hero or a general or a gangster and so on. So the idea, I'm interested in kind of going against this tendency. This is another game about sex. I made a long time ago, almost 10 years ago. Yeah, making games about everyday life instead of sort of balancing or like doing something that is alternative to everyday life, but also forcing the player into roles that are not empowered, like kind of forcing the player into roles that are awkward, that are not that pleasurable or disempowered and so on. This is an organ simulator in which you are this girl, unfortunate girl with a terrible boyfriend, and you have to fake an orgasm and pretend you're having a lot of fun. So it's kind of like a reading game. You have to just match your boyfriend. Eventually you can be like super happy. So this is called Turbo Flex, another early game in which you are. It's imagining a situation in which you have flexible workers, precarious workers, temporary workers that are essentially relocated in real time around the world through a system of pipes, of tubes. So 1 second you are working at the McDonald's and doing a shitty job, and then you get sucked into this pipe and spit into this other shitty job. And that's kind of what it was my life at that point. So it's kind of like autobiographical in a way. And it gets crazier and crazier, and you end up, that's a call center, bunch of really terrible games, mean games, and eventually you get expelled from the labor market. So this is a more recent one, also dealing with labor and alienation. This has a very different approach and style. This is called Every Day the Same Dream. In this case, you are this sort of like anonymous, faceless, one-dimensional man, white collar, trapped in this, his daily routine. So the game mainly consisted in you commuting, going to work. So you wake up and you take the elevator, you take the car, you get stuck in traffic. And then eventually you reach your cubicle, your computer station. You sit down, and the game starts over from where it started. Show you what happens. Yeah. And you're finally there. to press the right button and you start over. And it can go on forever. It's just a cycle. Except sometimes they don't. But sometimes players realize that there is something more into this game. It's not just a completely nihilistic sort of art game in which you just it's meaningless. They realize that there are some deviation from the norm. There are some clues that maybe there is something more. And so the goal of the game becomes to sort of to find all the possible ways you can sort of like subvert or kind of like break away from this daily routine. For example, you can walk left instead of right and have an encounter, or maybe like when you're stuck in traffic, you can just get out of the car and go for a walk and pet a cow. Yeah. And the game reaches a resolution when you find out all the possible ways to kind of like break free from your routine. You can just like show up to work without pants and so on, and get fired. So to talk about the next game, I'm gonna give you a couple of information about where I am now. I currently live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I teach in that school. That's the Carnegie Mellon University School of Art. So that's my building. There are artists and stuff. They're doing paintings and things like that. If you go down the street, you'll see a building which is part of the university, and it's called the Robotic Institute. It's essentially the robotic department, in which they do all sorts of things. They do all sorts of robots. Some robots are cute, like this one. Some other are maybe a little creepy, a little weird, like this one, also made in my school. Or my institution, universities, like a snake robot that can actually autonomously climb trees. Sometimes you see them throwing them at branches. And sometimes they are scary, like this one is called the Crusher, because it crushes people and things. The new version also has a machine gun on the top. And they are all funded by the US military. This is a flying Humvee without a pilot. You know, it's just like a SUV that flies by itself. What can possibly go wrong? So like, if you go down the riverside, also in Pittsburgh, there's this other building that is part of Carnegie Mellon, which is the Entertainment Technology Center. That's where they make video games. It's kind of like considered the video game department of my school. Inside it kind of looks like a spaceship. There's a kind of like a reproduction of an Enterprise sort of deck and life-size robots from science fiction. They're not real robots, but fantasy robots and so on. And at the center they make all sorts of video games. They make theme park rides and they make military research. Those are one day I just showed up and grabbed a bunch of their flyers. Those are their student projects. And you know, they make an educational game, and then they make stuff for stealth bombers, which are not like games based on stealth bombers. No, they're actually like working for the Northrop Grumman and doing all sorts of things for military. One is called Panoptics, and I think it's Lockheed Martin or something. And then there's another game for health or like for doctors and stuff. So this might seem a little weird from a European perspective, but it's not super weird. Like the military, well, there's actually a term for that, and it's this military entertainment complex, kind of like a riff on the military industrial complex. All my slides are a little cut, so just imagine very soon. So, well, I've been a United States taxpayer for about 3 years now, 4 years. And I sort of contribute to that, and I'm also kind of like getting paid by this institution that does all this kind of research and contributes to kind of the future of warfare, the near future of warfare, which is actually the present of warfare. Essentially, I'm being paid by an institution that is in the business of kind of like killing people. And this convergence between military and entertainment is not doesn't happen only on the academic, institutional level. happens in the technological level. This is a video game for training. There are video games for dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, simulation for troops and so on. But also happens on a cultural level. The current revolution in robotic warfare, the fact that more and more increasingly wars are being fought by robots, it's often associated with the idea of gaming. For example, in the drone warfare, right? I thought the best way to talk about this issue was through video games, because we have this kind of notion that the war is increasingly becoming like a video game. Here you see a juxtaposition between real footage from real drone and helicopter and footage from, I think, what is it, a Call of Duty mission. So they are almost impossible to differentiate. So yeah, we kind of like reach a point that both visually are the games and images of wars are indistinguishable, and even on an experiential level, you have this situation with drone and the remote control airplanes, essentially, which are operated by controllers that are kind of like shaped like video game controllers, and they have an interface, they have a very mediated experience. And on a deeper level, the promise of drone warfare is essentially to allow soldiers and pilots to fight without suffering the consequences, which is kind of like the whole deal about video games, right? That you can play, or the whole deal about games, that you can play and fail without risking, essentially. It's a safe space. So I decided that this was kind of like enough. I felt like I wanted to make a game about it, and I made this one called Unmanned that came out a year and a half ago. So this is a narrative game about a day in the life of a drone pilot. It's kind of like similar in a way to Everyday the Same Dream. In this case, you are a more specific character. You're a drone pilot in Nevada, and I was kind of imagining the daily routine of this new kind of soldiers. The game employs this kind of like setup that is a split screen, a kind of like a two-channel gameplay. So you have to sort of like you find yourself constantly multitasking between separated activities. So in one scene, you go back from your job, and you have to play games within the games, and you have a conversation with your son that will ask you things like, oh, so how was work today, or kind of like question you about just like contemporary warfare versus grandpa's warfare and so on. So you have to sort of like play that stupid shooter game and also pay attention to your son, trying to bond with you, and so on. So it's kind of like you usually have a language and monologue on one side and more like action-based task on the other. So this is one of the central scenes in which you're actually controlling your drone somewhere in Pakistan, and meanwhile you can have a conversation with your co-pilot. And the conversation is kind of like you're kind of flirting with her. So it's kind of like a dating scene. I don't know if you're familiar with dating scenes. Yeah. So the idea is to sort of like systematically kind of like break the attention and prevent the player from being completely absorbed in one simple kind of like muscle memory sort of action and reaction, kind of like push the player out of the narration a little bit. And the idea was also to experiment with a different kind of choice. This is has an element of action, but it's mostly a multiple choice, sort of choose your own adventure, and but you're not really choose your own adventure. The adventure is pretty much the same. What you're really changing is the way the protagonist, the main character, is essentially approaching these choices. So the protagonist, you're shaping the personality of this guy. You're deciding if he's a patriotic douchebag, or if he's kind of like a depressed, full of guilt sort of soldier that has to do his job. Anyway, all these examples I talked about are essentially taking advantage of this component of games that is kind of role play. You're playing as a character, you're sort of forced into this situation, And yeah, that's definitely a component, and it's important when you want to make expressive, artistic games. But there is a potential also in a very different kind of approach, which is the one I'm talking now. So the idea is games at their core are systems of rules, and they are systems of rules that you get to know by interacting with them. So you're testing the limits, exploiting their loopholes, you're kind of like choosing from a range of possibility and sort of like evaluating the outcomes. You're trying to figure out how the system works. That's kind of what playing games is. So the hypothesis is, since they are so like inherently systemic and intrinsically dynamic, games might be better suited to represent a complex and dynamic system as opposed to linear media. So the idea is, or at least the gamble is, if you want to talk about a systemic problem, if you want to talk about a social or economic system, games might be actually more effective than linear media. That's what I like to try to experiment. So there are many arguments about against fast food here in France. You're pretty familiar with them. McDonald's is not good for health. The restaurants are kind of depressing. It's gross. It's ugly. They're stupid. But I'm not too interested in those kind of like single issue reductionist critiques. I'm more interested in more like systemic problems that are related to the fast food industry and the meat industry, the beef industry as it is now. And those are systemic reasons. So I created a game that is essentially a management game based on McDonald's. You're managing the McDonald's corporation. So it's a resource management game. You start with soy, cows, and you're kind of like turning them into money through a process. But when I made the simulation, I wanted to include also the other sort of consequences that are usually not included in those management economic simulation tycoon games. Things like, well, the deforestation that happens, and therefore the global warming, and the desertification and poisoning, and so on. So the result is this McDonald's video games, which is a fake advertising game for McDonald's. It's presented as an official advert game for McDonald's, and puts you in the shoes, in the role of the CEO of the company. So the player is in this top-down position and has to manage this process between the 4 sections, essentially from pasture to the restaurant. Yeah, and the idea to sort of connect what the transnational capitalism sort of separates, because now we're not that intimate anymore with production processes, since production processes, even of burgers, even of food, is so like spread out all around the world that we are sort of like losing touch with the things that are surrounding us. So as the players sort of like starts to play, we'll start to realize that there are sort of like ways to maximize profits that might not be completely ethical. For example, you can decide to fire disaffected workers. You can decide to cut down forests in order to make more room for soy, and the soy will become fodder for cows. And so, as a whole, the game is kind of like a summary of all the criticism that have been done to McDonald's in the last 15 years or so. So the player is sort of not really forced to behave unethically, but definitely encouraged to behave unethically, because the system of the game doesn't really punish that kind of behavior. Exactly how, in the same way, in the real world, corporations are not really responsible or accountable for their misbehavior. So a similar approach is used in another management game that I made shortly after that, which is called oligarchy. In this case, the emphasis is more on the relationship between politics and oil industry, especially in the US context. So that's the first game I made when I moved to the US. So again, you have to manage a process, in this case extraction of oil from different scenarios. But in this case, you also have to interact with politics and sort of like convince your representative to, for example, go to Iraq or open up areas in Alaska, so you can drill national parks and so on. It's way more complex than I described it. Well, this is the mini game simulating politics in America, which you have two giant robots, and you have to throw them a lot of money so they can use it as fuel. You can possibly make a game like this for every industry, because pretty much every industry has issues, has externalities. Every production process produces something really unwanted. And I realized that I wasn't really immune to this critique either, because we tend to consider communication design, gaming, and everything that is digital. We tend to think about our jobs as kind of like immaterial and completely kind of like disembodied. But beneath this sort of like smooth informational surface, there is a kind of like a reality that is very material. And I'm talking about what is essentially those computers that we use, the servers that we have that are running our website, the smartphones. So I decided to make a game about this, it's an iPhone game about the manufacturing process, the creation process of smartphones. It's called Phone Story, and explore the dark side of this global economy and the problems related to technological consumerism. So this is not really exactly a simulation, it's more like a series of vignettes, mini games that are depicting various phases of the manufacturing process. And they are kind of like presented as if your gadget, your phone was talking about them, was describing them. So that's kind of like how it's a pretty terrible game, I've got to say.
Thank you for joining us. Let me tell you the story of this phone while I provide you with quality entertainment.
So yeah, I imagine you have your phone and a face telling you this is where I come from.
Once upon a time, there were minerals resting in the bowels of the earth. One of these minerals, called coltan, is found in most electronic devices. The majority of coltan...
So the games are fairly primitive, are super simple. This one you sort of have to do a whack-a-mole and try to make sure that all those kids are keep mining, and so you kind of like start playing almost unconsciously, figuring out the mechanics, and gradually the voice explain the context and the situation. Hey, what you're doing is actually very related to the very fact that you're holding this game, because this is referring to the extraction of minerals of coltan mostly happens in Africa, and those minerals are present in all PlayStations and all the capacitors and so on. This is, you might have heard of, because that became quite big, the whole story about Foxconn and the assembly factories in China. There was a wave of suicide happening at that point, and the answer from these factories, where all our gadgets come from, was, oh well, we will install some safety nets in order to address this problem, and that's kind of like a dark humor commentary on that sort of solution, instead of raising wages that then actually happened. But their first reaction was to catch them with safety nets. So this is kind of like another commentary on our side, like our consumerism and so on. So yeah, the game got banned immediately from the Apple Store. But the idea was to use it as a foundry. It's still on Android, so you can still get it. But the idea was to create a fundraising raiser tool, so the game is like available for like $1, €1 or so. And the idea is to just take this money and give it to the workers' organizations and the activist organizations that are actually working on the field, in the real world, to kind of like improve the conditions or change regulations about those issues. What I ended up doing was to simply donate, since it didn't make a lot of money because it got banned immediately, and we donated something like $6,000 to one of those factory workers who actually jumped off the building and survived and had a lot of medical expenses. So now, just to conclude, since I don't have much time, with this game I just don't want to promote certain ideas, I just don't want to spread certain alternative messages. to me, there is something that is probably even more crucial, and it's the issue of game literacy. So games and simulations are not neutral, politically neutral representations. They are, what I used to say is that between a city, a real city, and a formal representation, a game representation of a city, like SimCity, there is always a person or a bunch of people, a team, and these people have their own beliefs, they have their own value system, they are product of their own culture, and this background essentially informs and influences the way this model is translated, the way this real-world system is translated into a game. So even when a game designer, a game developer is not willing, is not interested in spreading a message, in giving, using it as a medium for commentary and so on, what really happens is that happens inevitably because you are, consciously or not, deciding what to include and what to exclude from a simulation. You're deciding sort of arbitrarily what are the internal relationship between this city or this family or factory, whatever you're portraying in your game. So all my games, the industrial games, are overtly political, overtly ideological, because they don't pretend to be neutral or realistic. The point is to show the degree of manipulation that can happen in games and interactive systems. So the goal is not just to change the way people see the world, but also to change the way people see and experience all games and all simulations. And that's it. 30 minutes.